Greetings to everyone and good afternoon to those who are joining us in South Africa and from your various different geographical location and time zones. My name is Porazi Dao and I'll be facilitating the program this afternoon on behalf of the Center for Women and Gender Studies, led by Dr. Babala Makotwana, the Chair for African Feminist Imaginations, Prof. Mlakola, and the Chief Albert Lutulu Research Chair, Prof. Buleng Sekhala, would like to welcome you to our conversation this afternoon on gender transformation in higher education. Our panelists, of course, led by our moderator, Prof. Pamela Dube, will take us through some of the debates in the sector, particularly when this conversation happens at a time where there are concerns about the slow pace of transformation as it pertains to women and as it pertains to minority groups, and such concerns which include gender-based violence on our campuses, gender discrimination, and sexual harassment. And as we're about to start the program, I'd like to welcome to the platform to give the official opening, Prof. Andre Kiet, the current DVC for Engagement and Transformation at Nelson Mandela University. Prof?
Thanks so much, Sipokaze. Hello, friends and friends. Welcome to this well-timed conversation titled Gender Transformation, Meanings, Practices, and Futures in Higher Education. I would like to offer greetings and a warm welcome to everyone joining us from different spaces and platforms. This is the first collaboration between the Center for Women and Gender Studies, Dr. Babawa Makotwana, the Sarchi Chair in African Feminist Imaginations, Prof. Pumla Dnea Gola, and the newly established Chief Albert Lutuli Research Chair, Prof. Buleng Sekhala. Considering this time of the year and how institutions are still navigating learning, teaching, and research due to the pandemic, we appreciate everybody taking time out of their schedules to join us this afternoon. I would like to share a special gratitude from our Vice Chancellor, Prof. Sibongile Mutwa, who will be joining us later in the evening because of other commitments. I have also been informed that Professor Puleng Lenkabula, the VC of UNISA, has sent her apologies due to leadership commitments she has to attend to this evening. A special welcome to our participants in today's program, our moderator for the conversation, Prof. Pamela Dube from the University of the Western Cape, Prof. Tenjiwe Mayiwe, the Vice Principal of Research at UNISA. Welcome, Prof. Lislan Gobosi from WITS, Prof. Edith Dunong Paswana from UNISA, Prof. Amina Mama from the University of Ghana can't unfortunately make it because of health challenges. Our thoughts are with her. Dr. Tandy Lewin from the Department of Higher Education and Training. Welcome, Tandy. Prof. Sarah Moswecha from the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Hello, Sarah. I would also like to recognize and appreciate the presence of former VC of UNISA, Prof. Naya Matabe, our DVC, Lebohanga Sacha, and members of the Nelson Mandela University community staff and students from various institutions, from UNISA and other places, and everyone joining us from different parts of the world. I greet you all. For us at Nelson Mandela University, transformation has been a cornerstone of how we envision ourselves as a dynamic African university. Over the past few years, we have established the Chair of Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation, 2018, the Center for Women and Gender Studies in 2019, and the Chair in African Feminist Imagination 2021, to ensure that we prioritize the transformation project beyond numbers, and also to focus on the power relations underlying knowledge production and its epistemic implications. Debates on gender transformation in the university sector date back to the apartheid era, even though they have intensified with the advent of democracy. The plight of women in academia has been highlighted in various publications since 1994. These include the work of Magubane and Mabokela, Hear Our Voices, 2004, Sitole and Equal Peers in 2008, Kuno Pashwane and Khoza and Black for Academic Voices in 2019, and Amima Manama's extensive work in Kodesra's higher education journals and Feminist Africa. Despite these extensive writings detailing the experiences of women in higher education in Africa and the progressive legislative frameworks and demographic shifts, we are yet to significantly change the everyday experiences of women in higher education globally. Amidst the transformative projects targeting women, there remain a continued underrepresentation of women in senior executive, management, and academic positions in most universities. In the recent article, Pulengse Gala and Edith Botswana remind us that this underrepresentation is the result of women having to confront perpetual belittling, being second-guessed, undermined, and having their authority questioned at every turn, as well as having to deal with being marginalized due to their age. These experiences in higher education suggest that we need to be intentional in how to promote and support women in leadership. Active measures must be implemented to increase the representation of women in different leadership positions across the system and across our continent. We should, in particular, address with urgency the postgraduate pipeline, respond to academic staff participation and progression patterns, tackle alienating and exclusionary institutional cultures and practices, and make a difference regarding the recruitment, retention, and progression of Black women academics in particular. The discourse about gender and transformation in universities also needs to respond to the scourge of harassment and gender-based violence enforced and undergirded by patriarchal ideologies. To promote full academic citizenship, my apologies, to promote full academic citizenship of women in universities, we will need to take proactive measures in creating safe campuses with zero tolerance for violence in any form. Advancing the discussions inclusive of the LGBTQI plus communities is imperative, and we need to drive the overall transformation debate in both historically disadvantaged and historically advantaged university in equal measure. To this end, the contributions today from our esteemed panelists will help us unpack the meanings, practices, and possible futures for gender transformation. And we hope that this conversation will begin to eliminate ideas and alternative ways in which we can begin to imagine better futures in African higher education. Once again, a hearty welcome to you all to this collaborative event between Nelson Mandela University and the University of South Africa. Much thanks for joining us. Thanks, Sipokazi.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that welcoming. And also just, I think, Prof, also just adding to some of the layers that we'll unpack in the conversation. I just want to now give an opportunity to Prof. Tandy Lewin just to contextualize gender transformation in higher education. But before we bring Prof, I'd just like to read just a brief bio as we welcome her to the platform. Prof. Tandy Lewin is a feminist scholar and is also part of the executive management of the University of South Africa, currently serving as the Vice Principal for Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization Portfolio. Prof has served as a university registrar and has extensive experience in higher education as a teacher, a researcher, and in administration. Prior to appointment at UNISA, she worked at various higher education institutions, including the HSRC, as a senior manager and researcher. Prof has an impeccable academic leadership and mentorship record with a strong focus on social science research in general, as well as indigenous knowledge systems. She is a member of various parastatals, community and civil society organizations, such as the Rural Women's Movement, where she's an advisory board member, the National Heritage Council, and the South African National Heraldry Council, where she serves as its chairperson. She has also presented numerous conference papers at national and international forums and authored a significant number of research articles, including co-publishing 5 books. All right, so without any further ado, I'd like to give the platform to Prof. Tandy Lewin. Prof.
Thank you so much. I hope you can see me and hear me.
Yes.
As thanks for that, Sporas. As we load shedding, I could not have been lucky to have been part of this conversation, which brings to me some sense of we sounding a big drum on feminist spaces and engaging on this. I bring to you colleagues greetings and apologies from Prof. Buleng Linkabula, who's in Durban, because she is engaging the heads of state there at an inter-Africa trade conversations that she's part of as we speak. Greetings to everybody. Prof. Andrew Kipps has taken us through, who is in the house. I don't want to say protocol is observed, but I am acknowledging all of you with such jubilation. In my language, we say, we see you, yes, Yanibona, and it's good to be here. And also because we are doing this transformation on gender, giving it that lens, the feminist lens, collaborating with the SACHI chair and Chief Albert Lutulu Research Chair and the Center for Women and Gender Studies. I mean, it's so beautiful to get all these colleagues together. First, as the starting point, we've got to agree that gender transformation in higher education will have different challenges that are expressed in a variety of meanings, in a variety of practices, and in a variety of different ways as starting point. These challenges should be viewed against the resolve of the African Union to transform the continent into a prosperous space where there's development and stability. The 2014 Agenda 2063, colleagues, the Africa we want, outlined 7 key aspirations that the continent should have accomplished by the time that the continent celebrates the 100th year anniversary of the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, that is doing that in 2063. Now, of these 7, the 6th one is very important for the higher education sector, but let me just take you through just briefly those 7. A prosperous Africa that's based on inclusive growth, integrated continent, Africa with good governance, democracy, space, respect for human rights, peaceful Africa, Africa with strong identity and common heritage, values and ethics. And number 6 actually is very important, which is about development of its people, unleashing the potential of women and youth. And for us as the higher education sector, the relevance of this aspiration number 6 is people-driven development that seeks to unleash the potential of women and youth within the continent. And Africa, as we know, has the youngest population in the world, which keeps on expanding all the time, leading to some references to the phenomenon of the youth is bulging. It was estimated in 2015 that there were 200 million young people in the ages between 15 and 24 on the continent, with that number projected to go to just beyond almost to 2.5 million. These young people must be absorbed within the higher education sector. And of course, we know all the limitations. A huge number of them are young women, and we are in the week possible. Some of you will have heard of a young woman who was killed, rather her body being put in a fridge, found by another young woman, all who are less than 25 years. And of course, that happening in Soweto. These things are very worrying. The second point, as we reflect on the conversation on gender transformation is not just only the fact that this is an academic or knowledge imperative, but that it is a political imperative. And the very able panel that we have this afternoon shall be taking us through that point of the political imperative of gender transformation. The third one is the fact that the African universities' starting point has got to be acknowledging epistemological and ontological foundations that have been disrupted by centuries of colonialism, slavery, oppression, and all the struggles that we see that have isms in them. Now, the center is that as we congregate this afternoon and towards the evening, we reflect about what the future holds for us, that we need to appreciate the fact that Ngugi wa Thiong'o spoke about this when he framed and expressed a gripe about the canons of the Europeans. He says, we actually have to move to the center, move Africa to the center, and from away where we had been because of the multiple centers from which the human civilizations originate. And it is very important for us this afternoon and evening to appreciate the fact that amongst us we have Professor Mina Mama, whose work we shall be learning more about, and from which we draw this context that we're presenting this afternoon. Mama's idea of academic freedom and the very idea of a transformed university cannot be divorced from the realities of the society in which the university exists, the contextual university, and the appreciation of the fact that we don't exist and should not be operating in isolation with where we find ourselves becomes very important. And therefore, logically, it follows that the questions that are asked about the university must be related to the context, must be the ones that look at how we define, construct, reconstruct, put apart, look at the social realities that we're exposed to. Hence the importance of the idea that universities cannot be just ivory towers, which is what we often gripe about. And of course, as I said, at a Kampala conference in 1990, Mama referred to that conference as a landmark where we had to define what she refers to as academic freedom. And we know the struggles around this as the higher education sector, in particular in this country, South Africa. And of course, this will be reverberating across the continent and beyond, and in the South in particular, in terms of how do we locate these imperatives of ensuring that we don't only have a talk show about transformations, but we do so take into account that the knowledges that should be shifting are knowledges that shift with the responsibility of ensuring that we see change, we see transformation that we so eloquently talk of in various regulatory frameworks that we have. She then says, that is the Mama, this public interest drove all the struggles that we have waged to make the inclusive, to ensure that we are responsible, hold the center responsible, and that we ensure that the women and men, obviously, are not just only forming, expressing the regimes that are divergent, but we look at the common good that we should be moving towards. In other words, as we think about the existence, our beings, various ways of knowing, we need to recenter and remember our African personality as a union, our humanity as a union, into our very own conceptions of what constitutes a university, of what constitutes varieties of knowledges, and of what a being is actually about. And in doing so, we need to be having to shape the futures, which is part of what UNISA is about, shaping the futures, and those futures we sure cannot shape without women, and women at the center and girls at the center. And how do we do that with all the challenges that we have, where we distort women, we kill them, we do a whole lot number of untoward activities on the woman body, as well as on the woman mind and on the woman knowledge system. Therefore, remembering the African and the woman also means there are knowledge systems and canons, and intellectual sense must be open to engage with various institutions, and of course with a variety of knowledges, the ones that we cast aspersions on, and also the ones that we need to be generating. And for Ngugi, this is actually what he refers to as the local is global, and the global needs to be local as we integrate the knowledges and get to have the plural versality, as he puts it. I like his reference to this because it so much reverberates what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says when she reflects on the fact that women from all walks of life need to add their voices in the growing national and global conversations that we should be having. And she says that it is in that way that we will need and shall have gender equality. Therefore, boys and girls, men and women, patrons of this webinar, this calls for reawakening and even of how we pose questions, what questions we pose, what inspires the framing also of those questions, which then we must be looking at in practice with all this theorization that we're talking about how we should be, could be, where we should be going given the challenges that we have. What does this mean in practice? Fortunately, within this country and a number of countries on Africa, and in particular in South Africa, since 1994 on paper, the legal framework and other institutional arrangements have made it easy to pursue gender transformation. And as I say, it has been actually much more good on paper than it has been in practice. Hence, of course, we have had to have these kind of seminars to step back, reflect, and check on where we are, as what Professor Puleng Nkapula makes reference to when she joined UNISA, says we need to have a kind of scholarship that engages the universities beyond who a singular university is about, but within the context that we find ourselves in, engage scholarship that is. And therefore for us in contemporary South African higher education, we have to make strides in advancing transformation. And I must actually be very proud that within the University of South Africa, we have the Department of Transformation within the office, actually, of the Vice Chancellor. That's how important this project is. But then, what do we have to show for it? Probably as we engage this afternoon and evening, we need to be looking at what should we be doing? What could we be expediting to ensure that we accelerate and have not just statistics and figures, but look at how we get women, we get girls, we get all genders in their varieties to access higher education. And as we reflect on that, check on what good are we making in that process of doing so. And thus institutions of higher learning, and UNISA in particular, would have had to entrench and ensure that the gender mainstreaming, the women mainstreaming, the girlhood mainstreaming is taken quite seriously to ensure that the academic project, the academy on its own as a whole is the one that ensures that the gender transformation is not just only on paper, it's not just only through units that we create, it's not just only through a lot of grants that we have, but practically, how have we and do we seek and have we shown the changes that we want to see for the benefit of all genders across the board, to which Prof. Andrea made reference to earlier. Transformation has become a recurring motive. It has been something that we refer to and address, more so post 1994 within this country, as an idea, a constant change, conversion, but the practicalities of that continue to elude me, in particular when on a daily basis, as statistics demonstrate, that we're not doing as good as we should be, despite our canons, despite our regulatory frameworks talking so good about what we are about. Therefore, colleagues, as we engage this afternoon, I call upon you to reflect on matters of racism, on matters of sexism, on matters of the girl child, on matters of the student, the woman student, on matters of various genders that we find within the university system, and how we as managers, including myself, feminists, and how as the patrons of this webinar, consciously or not, we continue to produce and reproduce the inequalities that continue to exist and that are a mirror of what happens external to the higher education sector, but get resounded within the walls of the academy. This is what Sekgalo and Paswana are said about when they call upon that the positions need to continue to be engaged with, in particular of the executive management, and that because they are very oppressive, toxic, violent spaces that women find themselves having to be questioned, their talent, their expertise, and their work that they do doesn't seem to count much. It is actually, as I call upon you colleagues, and on behalf of the Vice Chancellor of UNISA, Puleng Linkebula, that we look at how we engage with the gender transformations that we're calling for this afternoon and evening, for much more practical solutions, and put on timelines to that, and offices that we need to, including our own offices, to get them to account. And as we do that, the example of which we have this afternoon, the solidarities that we find to be together as sisterhood, girlhood, womanhood, and all the hoods that exist, including manhood, that we come together and check on how do we engage and dismantle these oppressive, violent spaces that we actually find ourselves operating in. And therefore, as we continue these deliberations this afternoon of gender transformations within our institutions of higher learning, that let's do so with wanting not just to say we have had a zillion webinars on these matters, but how have we contributed to the change, in particular to ensure that we change towards having an experiential life that's will be propounded by the very marginal students, the very marginal managers, the very marginal boys and girls, men and women that we actually are, I'm hoping, shall be talking about this afternoon. So overall, we must be asking important questions as our end, and as we ponder about the meanings and practices of gender transformation in higher education. It is. What has the core intellectual academic project done to advance the cause of women in higher education since 1994? And how have we done that relative to what we've done to men? Because unless we put these things on a scale of comparability, we'll not be able to count and provide statistics that speak to and demand the change that we want to see. What have we achieved institutionally and legally based on the policies that we've crafted, legislative scripts, and enablers that we've had? And as women, what have we done, or what can we do practically to advance the struggles that continue to exist in the higher education sector? What agency and agency do we need to have? These are questions that are posed to you, hoping that this journey, as we talk about it this afternoon and evening, shall lead us at the minimum to agree on a charter on gender transformation in the higher education sector with targets, with commitments, with clear accountability measures and tools that we shall be seeing and we need to consider, so that we, at least by the time that we hand over the baton to colleagues that we're mentoring right now, we will have said that we've made a mark that in some embarrassment, I must just say that the women of 1956 in this country, South Africa, that as a women movement, we haven't really all want to submit, come to embrace fully to a point where the actions that they put about, we've taken those actions and agency to higher grounds, leading to the changes that we seek to have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Meyiwa. Also just positioning gender transformation in the sector, and also just touching on some of the demands that the sector is currently working on in terms of who we're centering, in terms of how we produce knowledge, and also mainstreaming gender in the sector as well. And also just quite importantly there, Prof. Tandy, we're touching on the importance of measuring that work that we've done, or asking the question as to how do we measure the progress of that work, and also just bringing in some questions that I'm hoping that will be part of the conversation. As we get ready to bring in the panelists and the moderator, I'd just like to just remind us that, of course, we can make use of the chat section here in the webinar and the Q&A section to pose your questions or your comments, as well as if you're joining us via our YouTube live stream, of course, you can participate in the engagement via the chat section. And also just being conscious of the context that we're in. Some of our panelists, of course, are in areas where they are affected by load shedding. And so I'd just like us to just be aware of this as the conversation continues, in case we have some disruptions with connectivity. All right. I'm going to now welcome the panelists and the moderator to the platform. But as I do that, I'll just share some, just briefly, the biographies, so that we could also be familiar with who's in the room. I'm going to start with Prof. Dinong Paswana, who is an associate professor and head of academic programs at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. This is at the University of South Africa. Prof. Paswana holds a PhD in development studies from London South Bank University. She's the former acting head of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, Timali, which is also at UNISA. And prior to that, Prof. Paswana served as a member of faculty in the humanities at the University of Johannesburg. She is the co-editor of the NIHSS award-winning volume, Black Academic Voices, the South African Experience. Prof. was identified as one of Mail and Guardian's top 100 women changing South Africa in the education category in 2020. And as a scholar and activist, she continues to provide leadership in various organizations, as well as research and policy advisory services for the government of South Africa. And then our second panelist, Ulihle Ngobozi, who is a lecturer in governance, public policy, and gendered approaches to development. Lihle is the author of The Mothers of the Nation, Manyano Women in South Africa, a book that explores the intersection between the Black church, liberation theologies, and an African feminist analysis of the public sphere in South Africa. Lihle has worked as a senior research consultant in various ministries where she has been responsible for policy drafting, policy framework development, and providing early evidence-based research for policy positions. She graduated from Rhodes University with a master's degree in political studies and international relations in 2017, where she explored how the Women's Manyano Church Group offers a space for Black women's public performance of citizenship. Lihle holds a postgraduate degree in international relations, and in addition, she holds the Alan Gray Center of Leadership Ethics Fellowship. Previously, she has worked as a researcher at IRANI, which focused on the development of LGBTI rights in Southern Africa. Then our last panelist is Dr. Tandy Lewin, who works in the Department of Higher Education and Training as the Chief Director for Institutional Governance and Management Support in the University Education Branch. Dr. Lewin's responsibilities include student funding policy, oversight of NSFAS, university governance oversight, and student development and support matters, amongst other areas. Since February 2021, she has been acting as the Deputy Director General for University Education, and previously she coordinated the development of a national plan for post-school education and training. Prior to that, she worked for the JET Education Services, where she was responsible for monitoring and evaluation, and the Department of Education as a Chief Director for Equity in Education, and later for university policy. She has worked in the nonprofit sector, various universities, and philanthropic sectors as well. Her work has been broadly in the field of higher education policy and education and social justice. She holds a Bachelor of Social Science degree from the University of Cape Town, a Master's in Education and International Development from University College London Institute of Education, and a PhD from the University of the Free State. As our panelists get ready and join the platform, I'd like to also just provide a bio of our moderator for this conversation, Prof. Pamela Dube, who was appointed as the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Student Development and Support at UWC at the University of Western Cape in 2015. Prof. Dube oversees the Division for Student Development and Student Support, under which residential services, the Campus Health and Wellness Center, Student Administration, the Center for Student Support Services, the Financial Aid Office, and the Office for Student Development reside. She holds a BA degree and a BA honors in drama and performance studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She has a master's degree, which she obtained cum laude, a PhD, summa cum laude, in comparative literature and media studies from the University of Siegen in Germany. She has also completed managerial and leadership capacity development programs at various institutions. Prof. Dube's research background is in the field of literature and media studies. She has published a range of internationally recognized publications with a special focus on gender issues, post-colonial literature, the oral tradition, and broader media. In addition, she has published several research articles in national and international journals, and is also a founding editorial board member for Resonance, the Journal of Sound and Culture from the University of California Press. All right. I'd like to then hand over to Prof. Pamela Dube as she leads the conversation, and just to remind colleagues as well that they can participate in the conversation via the chat section by leaving your questions and comments, and via our YouTube stream. Prof. Dube.
Thank you very much, Sipokazi, and many thanks again to the organizers for inviting me. and for granting me the opportunity to moderate this very important conversation led by our distinguished panelists. So good afternoon to all participants on this platform. To kickstart off the conversation, I'd like to start with submitting in agreement actually with Professor Meyiwa that there is considerable evidence that the South African government in particular has introduced a number of initiatives as well as legislation to specifically support women post-apartheid. However, gender and race, in particular race discrimination, is still an issue that we continue to grapple with. You may know the SABPP Women's Report, especially of 2011, which shared information that indicates that about 50.9% of the South African population consists of women, and that 87% of females are literate, suggesting that a good proportion of women have the opportunity to attend school and possibly attain some kind of form of tertiary education. Furthermore, the equal access to an academic education and career that women have enjoyed for the past years has not thus far led to equal outcome in terms of academic, management, and leadership positions, including in pay, research, and publications in the higher education setting. And this is according to a new report by UNESCO. The outcome of the gender gap is also related to broader conditions of employment and labor, part-time versus full-time, permanent versus temporary contracts, and so on. And this is contained in the 2020 report of UNESCO titled Women in Higher Education, Has the Female Advantage Put an End to Gender Inequalities? The report also documents that there is a dearth of women at the top and among academic teachers and researchers, that women are overrepresented among teaching staff, especially at lower education levels, but their presence drops in tertiary education. In 2018, for instance, 43% of teachers in tertiary education were women, compared to 66% and 54% in primary and secondary education, respectively. In 2020, just 30% of the world's university researchers were women. In essence, the increased participation of women in educational systems has also not translated clearly or consistently into labor market success or higher socio-economic status, the report says. The South African efforts in higher education for targeted appointments, for instance, initiatives such as the NGAP or the South African Research Chairs Initiative, or SACHI as we know it, are but a few of the efforts to address these disparities. It is encouraging that as recent as June 2021, a SACHI chair in African Feminist Imaginations was launched at Nelson Mandela University. And as we know, Professor Phumla Qola occupies it and believes that, I quote, the chair is all about shifting how we think about gender power and women's contributions in the world. This includes generating research on the archive of African women's intellectual and political work as key thinkers, theorists, and figures in the liberation struggle, decoloniality, and transformation, end quote. It's even more encouraging that this conversation today is hosted by the chair in African Feminist Imaginations and the Center for Women in Gender Studies at the Nelson Mandela University, together with the newly established Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair at UNISA. So to start interrogating these gendered hierarchies in the production of knowledge, 4 questions have been sent and shared with the panelists to shape the conversation as they share their thoughts and experiences as they wish. Could I have the questions, please, projected on the screen so that at least you get an idea of the kind of areas that the panelists would be touching on as they take us through this conversation. One of the questions, the first one is about how we have many gender mainstreaming advocacy programs in our institutions, but are they making a difference? And is advocacy enough? And what effective approaches can we use to tackle the myriad of challenges that we are continuously having to confront in our efforts towards gender transformation? And then we would like the panelists to also just to touch base in terms of their thoughts on the current challenges on gender-based violence and harm and sexual harassment, and on the continued gender division of labor and the introduction of corporate bureaucratic cultures aimed at sustaining higher education, and how these threaten the very citizenship of women and sexual minorities in higher education. Also, just so that we do not remain in isolation as a country, we wanted to just make sure that if the panelists could also touch on thoughts on international and including national efforts and their impact at institutions of higher learning, and what could be done to streamline these effectively. I know Prof. Mayiwa talked about the AU imperatives and some of the works that have been done internationally. We've got the SDGs, the National Development Plan within South Africa, and how all of these then, of course, are aligned, aligned with some of the imperatives that we have as a country and as higher education. And in particular, then, if the panelists could touch on some of those, we would appreciate that. So we will start in the order that's in the program, and give each panelist then some time, at least about 20 minutes, to address these questions and share really in the conversation the way they wish to. And so we will start with Professor Paswana. If you're ready, Prof. Paswana, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dube. I really, really appreciate that. And it's such a great honor and privilege for me to connect with colleagues here at Nelson Mandela University again. And good afternoon to our audience. And thank you for joining the conversation this afternoon. And let me also appreciate the consortium that brought this conversation together. This conversation in many ways happened in the interest of justice and seeking to restore full humanity of female persons, as well as those of gender non-conforming persons. So we are all aware that global gender disparities continues to be a challenge, and it affects all sectors of society, including the higher education. And this is why this afternoon we are talking about this sector. Also, what we are aware of, which is quite really disturbing, is the cost of gender discrimination globally. The cost of gender discrimination it's huge globally. If you check the OECD report of 2016, which also did an analysis of these costs, somehow we learned that gender-based discrimination cost around 12 trillion or 16% of global income. And that's a huge amount of money. And when you zoom it down here at home in South Africa, you also realize that it costs us between 28.4 billion rands to 42.4 billion a year. That's a lot of money. The other important disturbing report that came in 2021 is the recent gender gap report. And as you can see, when it analyzes different regions of the world, you realize that it will take many years for us to reach to close the gender gap or reach gender parity. And sub-Saharan Africa, where we find ourselves, somehow it will take us around 121.7 years for sub-Saharan Africa to close the gender gap. All this data is quite disturbing, not just for the higher education sector, but for society as a whole. So when we come down to the higher education sector, we also realize that the higher education sector has not been established with women or certain people in mind, let alone as leaders within the sectors. And hence it remains deeply divided in terms of race and gender. In South Africa, somehow we realize that an analysis of gender transformation that leaves out race is always insufficient. And data on women in higher education needs to be disaggregated always when we look at it, according to race, sexual orientation, nationality, and so on and so forth, just to give us a clearer picture of what is actually taking place in this space, because women's experiences are varied and they also depend on different identity markers. A recent study that we published with Palgrave, the Handbook of African Women, shows these discrepancies using secondary data nationally. For instance, it was quite disturbing for us to also realize that the majority of Black and colored women in South Africa are still without matric. And that is based on statistics of 2020. Almost 59.8% of Black women and 63.2% of colored women have no matric. Matric in this country facilitates access into higher education, the very sector that we're speaking about today. Even in the other sectors where South Africa tends to claim significant representation of women or leadership, women in leadership, where we are trying very hard to hail success of parity. Usually for women, it happens in spaces where they participate as elected officials, rather than where their skills and competency are sought, such as in professional settings. So this is a huge concern, considering that if our society recognizes women in spaces where they come in numbers because they've been voted into those spaces, what does this also tell us? It's a big problem for us as a country. So for now, while we know that, there's a lot of talk around the growth in female enrollment within the sector. And this is also international, but this has not translated into enhanced career opportunities for women. You remember in 2012, UNESCO published a study and reported that women are not given opportunity to use their doctorates, even if they have doctorates in their field of research. They found that this increased enrollment somehow disappears at the PhD level and research careers. So the problem also, we find that the problem also manifests itself in the notion of meritocracy. And because in this sector, meritocracy somehow is measured through PhD and research outputs, rather than these other two aspects of academic work, teaching and learning and community engagement, in which you find, as Professor Mayiwa indicated earlier, or is it Professor Pumla Dube, I'm not sure, but one of the professors that spoke before me talked about the majority of women in the lower ranks carrying loads of teaching in our universities. So within the higher education sector, gender mainstreaming on its own does not really fit well with the prevailing culture within these spaces. The sector is highly competitive and has always used the notion of performance and merit to exclude women. And women are not often associated with meritocracy within this sector. And hence the system does not even know how to deal with successful women who are super achievers within the sector. Instead, they get bullied because the system is not ready to accept women who are super achievers. So in terms of your question around advocacy programs, yes, in many ways, advocacy programs are good, but they are slow to show results, but they can be effective in certain circumstances. However, I would like to argue that they are not sufficient, as we need continuous engagement to prove their value internally within the sector. Sometimes advocacy programs lack genuine buy-in from the top, and most executives within our university, male or female, are highly privileged and may not see their value as they are caught up in performance management cultures that does not take gender equality serious, but are focused on achieving targets. I've had even women leaders in certain spaces talking about mentoring young women as postdoctoral students coming, making sure that they will publish, and yet coming back to complain that not even a single publication came out because of the workload or the double burden of family and work. And ultimately, they opt to go and find postdoctoral students who are male because they have the pressure to show results and outcomes. And this is a huge problem, I think, also that we need to deal with. The other factor that makes them insufficient as a way of gender mainstreaming is that they are often designed and implemented in isolation. So many of us who are for or against equality, sometimes people they are likely to distance themselves from them, especially if something is saying gender, if it's a gender campaign and it has this actually right in your face. A lot of academics will actually distance themselves from those kind of advocacy programs that actually are front. So also let us not take for granted the fact that majority of our academics are trained not to take a stand on political matters. So issues like gender and race matters is a no-go area for many of our academics. And this is why when people are agitating within the campus around these issues, in many cases, people would not even attempt to join because they don't want to be seen as standing for a particular cause. And this is understandable sometimes why people are also holding back, because to be honest, patriarchy and like race punishes and disciplines harshly. So with regard to the first question, that will be my view on the first question. When it comes to effective approaches that we can use to tackle this myriad of challenges, I would submit this afternoon that we need to ensure that we support young women to finish matric, not just to finish matric with 30%, but ensure that they finish matric with flying colors. And we need to give them confidence about their aptitude at the very early age while they're still at secondary school. Because by the time they enter university, and if they enter university with no confidence, this becomes a problem in terms of mentoring them and also taking them through. And because they enter with these low confidence levels, even when you think about it, it makes it difficult for them even to follow certain careers that they might have been able to participate in, including becoming academics. And when they enter with those low confidence marks that the low marks that they have attained, somehow they just throw themselves everywhere, and you will find that certain spaces, they find them as no-go areas. So perhaps when we need to really take the issue of high school education very seriously as a country in order for us to be able to get the desired results for our young women. Training programs and also furthering one's study are strategies also against gender discrimination. When we introduce them, we must also be deliberate around training. Recently, we were training as a school I don't know if I should say, one of these government entities, and there was a concern around why are only men who are being sent outside rather than women. But how do you send people outside as ambassadors, as attachés, when you have not trained them? Because when you recruit, you need to have been trained in 1, 2, 3, 4. But the training programs, as we engage with the training programs, we also realize that there are no women when we go as instructors to these entities. We realize that there are no women, and that explains why you can't even find women in those type of positions. So it has to start here. And one of the advices that we gave was for them to also consider using a quota system in training, beginning with training. And we should not compromise. That means even when we go through the quota, we must not even compromise on standards. But and I think there should be nothing wrong in targeting a certain percentage of women and being able to say upfront when you advertise training that at least a certain percentage of candidates this time should be women. So this low confidence that I'm speaking about, you also find it even when women are leaders. You find that the subordinates, male and female, are also not even confident to support women leaders simply because they are also skeptical about being led by a woman themselves. And hence that's why you find these contradictions of wanting a woman leader, but at the same time, people not having the confidence when they are led by a woman. So these are some of the issues that I think will be approaches that we need to really take cognizant of. Also, when we try at this university to visibilize success, women in our leadership or at our institutions, in many cases, what we do is that we are always telling stories of success only. And yet we are not writing about what the university is failing to do for majority of our women, whether it's in your local university, INTCOM or whatsoever, not just even publicly or nationally in the newspapers. We are giving a single story of success, and these also have so many setbacks because the stories, some of these unpleasant stories of women needs to be out there for the public and for the university in particular to be able to understand the struggles that women face within the institution, and they should be public in many cases. So our communication departments at universities also do this practice of just showing successful stories, even if it's for internal communication. And I think that also needs to change. My thoughts around gender-based violence and harm and sexual harassment. Of course, we are often told that, corporatizing the university will sustain it. However, what we continue to see is exploitation and abuse of women's labor within this matrix. And this has resulted in situations where women leaders hardly finish their terms or go for second terms in leadership at our university. And this does not happen with women who are the face of power, like your vice chancellors or your deputy vice chancellors, but it also happens in the middle and senior management. And this is where the most bullying occurs. Of course, bullying, if bullying happens to the vice chancellor, of course, it will be known nationally, it will be an issue. But for the middle managers, for the senior managers who are experiencing these on a daily basis, it plays out in committees, in meetings, at Senate or different meetings where people find themselves in selection committees. And this culture of bullying and intimidation of colleagues happens with impunity, while people are just looking, at and doing nothing about it. And yet everyone can see that this is bullying. So the culture of bullying and intimidation of colleagues happens with impunity. It plays out at this level of middle management, of senior management, to intimidate any aspiring young woman who will dare to stand up for the next leadership position. So when you add sexual minorities to the mix, then the threats are also amplified as the university upholds certain cultures which are generally exclusive in nature. Generally, the university as a global power structure is a very heterosexual, patriarchal, Christian-centric, racist entity which upholds hegemony at all costs. It is for these reasons that the experiences of women and sexual minorities are always undermined and dismissed when they are being brought up. So we must also remember that academics, by their very nature, they enjoy the privilege of being at the helm of knowledge production. Hence, they continue to produce volumes of papers on the very social ills that we are grappling with in society. However, living this ideal of equality is a problem for many of our academics. And why do we continue to experience these things that makes us and others unhappy while we write so eloquently about them? Is it just a performance or to get a promotion? Why are we failing to practice what we preach? It's simply because the currency of academic stature stems from musing about these social ills without actually being assessed as to whether we are living these ideals. And hence, there is also in many ways, yes, I agree, it is middle class at the same time. So somebody was saying that, is it a continuation of what happened under apartheid? Because under apartheid, we found racists making careers internationally, writing all sorts of things about the evils of apartheid, and yet refusing to transform the very spaces where they find themselves in. And I think those are some of the problems that we might need to deal with regard to how. Hello, can you hear me, Professor?
Yes,
Palmer?
Prof, we can.
Yes, it looks like you're back. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you. So these are some of the problems that we find within the spaces of the academy. And well, when it comes to these efforts of international and national, to be honest, I'm not sure if we as academics, we participate in, effectively in these national efforts, except as consultants and researchers, to make awareness and also to have impact that will transform our spaces. The questions that we need to be asking around this is, are we really represented in many of these efforts? If so, what role do we play in these bodies? As researchers, as consultants only? Is that enough? Is it sufficient? And also, when you bring all these national efforts also. Our academics, if you look at it, I think the formation of the MTT ministerial task that we had in this sector was a step in the right direction that we saw playing out nationally as well. And also when you look at, I think years back, Rhodes used to have a women's forum. I'm not sure currently what is happening at Rhodes with that women's forum that they used to have at Rhodes. But our women's forums, are they actually making any difference? Thank you, Nomalanga. Yes, WASA used to be at Rhodes. So, you know, when you look at our women forums, what are they actually doing to make sure that they speak? And I don't want to speak about a particular spaces or universities, but it's quite disturbing when you also see that you have a women's forum in a particular university. There is a serious gender issue that you are experiencing as a university. And when you want support, you find out of the whole forum, only 3 women. And hence I'm arguing that academics somehow are trained not to stand for a position. They are not able to say, this we cannot tolerate, this we cannot actually stand for. They don't want to take a position on political matters. And this is why this sector it's going to take us as a sector to transform these spaces. It's going to take us a long time to do this. In many of the spaces, there's also spaces, particularly spaces outside the academy, that we need to be trying to interface with as higher education, and how we can also streamline some of these. You find that there is no patience with our language. There's no patience with how we look at the world. There's no patience with the academic jargon that we use when we interface with other sectors, and particularly, I mean, we have so many organized civil society groups, women groups in this country that actually can support the sector if we come together as women in the academy, and we can actually use some of these. But in many cases, there's always a contestation around, we don't want this to be very academic, or we don't want this to be very academic. And academics also hold back because they are not confident enough to engage with practitioners and activists at that level. Perhaps we need to also think and change how and think about how to engage with other groupings outside of the academy. And I think in the interest of time, let me stop here. Perhaps other things will come during the question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Very valuable input. I'm very much also aware of the time factor, so I'm not going to give a summary. I think we all got to appreciate your valuable input, especially around the issues of data that you provided on the cost of, gender-based discrimination for not just for the country, but also internationally, and the impact on higher education. And you also gave very practical solutions to start thinking around, and we appreciate the comments on the chat box. I'm sure Sipokazi is also taking care of them, but I really would like for us to leave more time for discussion later, because we really have to finish exactly at 6. Our last speaker who's going to do closing remarks also has to leave exactly at 6, and some of us do have commitments around that time. So without going into detail with summaries, I think I'll just move to the next panel panelists. I'm not sure if Lisa is able, can we just test again? There were some issues with load shedding and being able to get on board. If we can just test if you're able to come on board, Lisa. Otherwise, we'll move to Tandy, if that's possible. But can we just check if Lisa is able to come on board?
Prof. Dube, I don't think so at this moment. I'd like to then suggest we go to Prof. Tandy, to Dr. Tandy.
Okay, so Dr. Tandy Lewin, over to you, and then we'll just have questions on everybody right at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Dube. I'm just trying to get out of the full screen so I can get to my piece that I've written. Thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me to participate in this really exciting seminar. I'm truly honored to be here and to be in this panel with Prof. Paswana and Lihle and so many other colleagues and friends and feminists. Thank you very much to all the organizers and all of you that have played a role in setting this up. Given the wide expertise on this panel and the diverse experience in this virtual room, I'm going to try and stick to my lane in a sense and focus on the policy environment and policy matters. This is what I've researched myself for my PhD, and it's also been the focus of my working life for many years now. In doing that, I hope that I might try and give some insight into the issues that have been outlined for the seminar. In particular, though, why is it that stubborn gender hierarchies continue in the production of knowledge? What dimensions of gender power remain out of view? And why, despite progressive policy, do gender inequalities persist in higher education? So as a bureaucrat, of course, I will start by saying that in many ways, if you look only at the statistics, then South Africa looks very much like other parts of the developed world, of the global north. We have large numbers of women students at undergraduate level. The current figure is approximately 61% in South Africa. We have a growing cohort of female academics. We have a perceived feminization of many fields of study, although of course there are some areas that remain male dominated. And of course the continued inequalities in the professoriate are well known and in the senior leadership of universities. But this is actually a global phenomenon. As already mentioned, women now dominate in the administrative ranks of our public university system. In 2019, these are the latest available audited HEMAS data that we have. Overall permanent staff numbers show 54% of all staff in universities are women. In administrative categories of staff, women make up 59% of staff. In terms of instructional and research staff, those are the academic staff, women are 48% overall. African staff are only 41% and African women only 17% of this total. But having said that, this is quite a shift from what it used to be. 59% of academic staff overall are Black, 46% of those in management are women. This is, again, a massive shift. 32%, however, of full professors are women, 42% of associate professors, 48% of senior lecturers, and 54% of lecturers, 53% of junior lecturers. Of course, there are very big differences across disciplines. So although the gap has decreased significantly, of course, if you look at the higher levels of staff, the gaps are still very obvious. There are only currently 6 women vice-chancellors, that's out of 26 public universities. But having said that, this is also the highest number that we have ever had. There are also only currently 7 universities where the chair of council is a woman. But if you dig deeper into the leadership, academic and institutional cultures of our institutions, the questions arise as to how much the changes in representation reflect a deeper change. And this is a global issue as well. Over 40 years of advancing women in higher education in the global north has not shifted the concrete floor or the glass ceiling, whatever you may want to call it, as substantially as it should have. And there are many scholars that are pondering this and have been doing so for many years. In South Africa, then the question would be, has the gendered nature of higher education institutions changed qualitatively? There we can say a resounding no, it has not. Long after demographic changes have taken place, cultures and practices lag behind, and insidious forms of discrimination continue. We've started to hear a lot about that already, embedded in supposedly neutral policies and implicated in informal cultures and processes. So policy is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Many have written about this globally. Our focus on measuring gender equity and transformation is what Louise Morley calls a liberal approach. It doesn't deal with deeper relational aspects of gender. Yes, there's been progress, significant progress, but it seems to continue to be difficult for gender equity considerations to be maintained in institutional and policy imaginations. Ghost and Hassim in South Africa in 2014, reflecting on 20 years of democracy, describe what they call an institutional turn in gender equity. How do you move from measuring to substantive quality issues? They were writing specifically about 20 years after the transition to democracy, and they argued that the institutional turn in gender politics in the way in which it's been incorporated into state policy has yielded uneven gains. Over the past 20 years, the economic and reproductive questions appear to have been edged out by a focus on this version of liberal feminism that delinks formal equality from the question of equality outcomes. The challenge in their view is how to think about gender beyond the numbers to incorporate a deeper set of criteria to assess our progress. Liz Langer has also written about this. She's a higher education scholar, currently at DVC. She has provided analysis of how political arguments are translated into policymaking and how the institutionalizing of complex transformation matters sanitizes and reduces them to quantifiable indicators and renders the complex invisible. As part of this process, a common sense notion of transformation emerged as expressed in policy texts, while also locating transformation thinking as sector-based, and whose conceptualization did not take into account the broader social context within which sector-specific transformation took place. And she's speaking specifically about higher education. The effect of this, she argues, is to develop strategies that don't pay attention to the structural conditions that might accelerate, slow down, halt, or make impossible social transformation of any depth. I think that we need to pay attention to these arguments when we're talking about gender equity in a university context, and both when we're talking about national and institutional policy. Universities, through their core roles of teaching, research, and community engagement, can have a significant impact on changing society and in changing understandings of gender and gender inequities. And this work is critical, but also in understanding how gender impacts on the work of universities, higher education, and institutional cultures. Universities could do a great deal more to pay attention to this. Of course, policy itself also has limitations. It is organic, it is complex, and it is interpreted and sometimes ignored. Stephen Ball, he's an educational sociologist, has written, policy is both text and action, words and deeds. It is what is enacted as well as what is intended. Policies are always incomplete insofar as they relate to or map onto the wild profusion of local practice. In policy studies, there's this concept of wicked problems, and social problems like those confronting us in this discussion are definitely that. Wicked policy problems are complex to address, the solutions are not clear, and the information about the possible impact of interventions is limited. There's no one definitive understanding of the problem or solution. Relating to the persistent lack of women in science, one writer says, it's what a scientist would call a wicked problem. Pull at one thread and discover 10 more just as unsolvable. Through work that I've done in policy analysis, I think that I would say that gender equity has actually started to disappear from higher education policy documents. It's rarely referred to independently. And there are many reasons for this. It could be that gender equity has shown numerical progress, whereas racial inequities have been very slow to change. There has definitely been a premature triumphalism about the achievement of gender equity because, for example, of women's predominance at undergraduate level. This has probably focused attention away from gender equity. There's a lack of consistent focus on gender equity in policy and policy analysis. The complexity of managing gender change is significant and requires layers of inquiry and understanding. And much of the real change required is at institutional level, and it may be difficult to drive through national policy. So I guess I would ask a question really after saying that, which is, do we need more specific and focused attention to gender equity in higher education policy? A sharper focus may be necessary going forward. And then I just want to pick up on this last point about institution level work. There's such a great deal of interesting research coming out now, especially in recent years, not just formal reports from the DHET, from the Department of Science and Innovation and other organizations, but also from within the academy. I briefly want to refer to some of this, as some of the people that have written about this say it so much better than I could. I'm not an academic myself, not working in an institution, but I also draw a little bit of my own work focusing on early career women academics. Amina Mama, who was going to be with us today, unfortunately isn't. She notes that much of the research on gender in organizational life has shown how ostensibly neutral formal procedures for selection, recruitment, and promotion often have gendered outcomes that are seldom acknowledged because of the hegemonic assumption that institutions are essentially rational and egalitarian in their functioning. And she was writing in 2003, this is some of her work that was published in the Cadastria journals. And I think it's very important for us to think about how gendered ideologies operate in our society and organizations. Ideas relating to domesticity, the ideas of ideal workers and neutral jobs have profound effects on universities. It's absolutely necessary to study the micropolitics of everyday working lives. We've heard many of the stories of microaggressions, of bullying and those kinds of things. A lot of the literature that we are starting to hear much more loudly and more see much more visibly focuses on these things, on how academics are expected to do more with less, the burdens of increased accountability, although I have to say that there's also a good side to this, the complexity, the growing complexity of working in universities, and the greater levels of competition and the expectations of ideal employees, which have very significant effects on women and on other marginalized groups in higher education. There's also a fantastically growing literature on intersectional challenges, on issues of class and race, and how feelings of alienation and exclusion profoundly impact on academic identities in the academy. I want to just quote, because she says it so beautifully from this wonderful book, which Prof. Paswana was a joint editor of. And it's a book that's won an NIHSS award and was published by the NIHSS. If you don't have a copy, it's a really incredible read if you're interested in these issues. And this is Peace Kigua, who's a professor at Wits University. And she says, part of the dilemma has to do with the almost invisible nature of informal institutional cultures within departments. These function to reinforce and sustain hegemonic practices, spaces, and traditions of the academy that are exclusive to already marginalized bodies. These cultures and communities of practice are so invisible as to render any challenge and resistance almost impossible, precisely because one would first have to undertake the work of making the invisible visible. Dr. Natane's painful description of the feeling of sitting on one bum in describing her long experience of marginalization and exclusion in academia, also many other voices that come through in this particular volume and other volumes that we're seeing coming out. Peace Kigua again, you see, I really like quoting her. Space is far from neutral, but exists in already assigned meaning systems that are defined through relations of power. These relations of power and the spaces they create and sustain allow for particular communities of practice and bodies to feel either alien or have a sense of belonging in that space. To enter space, therefore, is to engage the symbolic, discursive, and material forms of power. And I want to talk a little bit about this a bit more. I mean, we also had, interestingly, a report of a ministerial task team on the recruitment, retention, and progression of Black South African academics. I think some of the people attending today may well have participated in that work. It was finalized in 2019. And they have a recommendation number 11. It says the following: perhaps the most important recommendation to be made in this report is the need to tackle institutional and individual racism and sexism in direct and visible ways, including through penalizing perpetrators, but also in ways that assist to build institutional cultures that embrace diversity and that are anti-racist and anti-sexist. This means moving from hoping that this will happen naturally to actually putting measures in place to ensure it happens. Universities must interrogate how institutional cultures and traditional practices may be creating alienating environments that intentionally or unintentionally work to exclude, and put proactive measures in place to address this. University leadership and management must lead in this regard and must receive training in how to do so where this is needed. But the question is really, how can this be done? certainly there's a need for deliberate, reflective, and targeted work across institutions. Part of this is also understanding how issues of gender-based violence and sexual harassment are not only about individualized actions and individualized experiences, but they're actually about systems of power and culture and institutions that operate systematically on people's daily working and study lives. So I've already shown that numbers don't tell you much about gender justice and gender transformation, about epistemic justice. And we can't only rely on policy, but we have to do much deeper and more complex work. Gender discrimination exists through ideologies that exist in society and therefore in institutions. And this means that institutional practices are not gender neutral. Very few institutional practices are gender neutral, if any at all. Through understanding these ideologies and discourses and practices, approaches to change could be better understood. Everyday sexism is real and it has profound effects on experiences and academic identities. This is something that I certainly have found through my own research. There are individual examples of epistemic injustice on a daily basis, combined with aspects of hermeneutical injustice within institutions, such as leadership failures in managing issues like fair workloads, institutionalized forms of sexual harassment, and also treating gender injustice as individualized interactions rather than matters that can be dealt with institutionally. These result in institutional cultures that are blind to systemic gender inequalities in the working life of academics and in the study life of students. These have profound effects on lived experiences, and I would love to talk more about it, but in the interest of time, I won't. Issues of academic identity and professional identities in the academy. So when you look at gendered institutional cultures in these ways and you pay attention to the deep layers of ideology and discourse, then solutions can begin to emerge. You know, if we want to retain women in universities, which is a very big issue, wanting women to actually move up into higher positions, there is a tension between individual choice and structural inequality. Women have to either fit in or opt out, and opening up the discursive space on gender in organizations is absolutely necessary if we want to work out what to do. So in thinking about what a gender just and a gender equitable university might look like, are we focusing on fixing the women or fixing the university? This is a question asked by Birkinshaw and White in 2017. There's a huge literature on this elsewhere, but also growing in South Africa and on the continent. This is a huge issue, I think, for higher education policy. A university that addresses gender equity with intentionality and purposive and deliberate ways could explore how better to positively address the institutional factors that can enhance career development for women and reduce the negative constraints on their career development, rather than expect women to adjust their ways of being and doing academic work to fit an idealized model of an academic worker or a worker. I wanted to make, I'm coming close to conclusion, Chair. Just one point about gender-based violence and sexual harassment that's been sort of bothering me for a while. I think the hard reality of what happens in our society on a daily basis is well known, and it's well talked about. I just want to make one point about this, and I think it links to the issues of accountability and reporting and institutional cultures that I mentioned before. I think at one level, the lifting of visibility around issues of gender-based violence and harm has been a critical shift in our society in recent times. And the fact that it's widely talked about is an incredibly important step to addressing the deep problems that exist. And there are big shifts in terms of institutional policy and practice in this area. We can see that. At the same time, however, there's something that can get lost in the performativity around talking about gender-based violence and sexual harassment. I don't know if that's the right word or if that encapsulates what I'm trying to say, but the more you talk about something and the more you relegate it also to a measurement agenda, much in the way that the policy analysts I quoted earlier have said, the less can get done in really addressing the systematic issues. I don't want to be misunderstood, so perhaps I'll go back to the point that to say that policy is insufficient. It's only a starting point. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about professional identities. That's for another day. Also wanted to talk about how leadership ideologies are so gendered. And there's also a great deal that's been written about this, specifically in higher education as well. But perhaps that for another day. And then if you'll allow me, and this follows a really powerful story of engaging with a young PhD, I think it's PhD student or postdoc that she was working with at presumably at her university. And this again is Prof. Pigua. And she says, the work of reminding and explaining our humanity to others and racism's effect on our bodies is bone-tiring work. It is also distracting. Entering and participating in spaces not constructed with our bodies in mind often means that we attempt some form of justification for our presence. And so we engage in self-surveillance practices that cause us further anxiety and distract us from the real work of getting on with our development in both professional and personal capacities. I think I wanted to end with that, and also to say that she also makes the point that Prof. Paswana also powerfully made just now about how important it is to talk about not just stories of success, but stories of grappling with these kinds of issues, and how difficult the journey for many people who have succeeded has been. And then, yeah, I hope I've stimulated some questions and discussion. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewin. I really wish we had more time, even for the questions, because there's so much that's been coming on the chat box. But thank you so much for giving us insights to the complexities of policy and its inadequacies, and for sharing some insights also into your own research work. I realized I was just looking there actually on the side here, Sipokazi. It doesn't look like Lihle has been able to join us again, but I'm also very mindful of the fact that we only have 7 minutes to the close, and there've been really wonderful input on the chat box. But I think really the audience needs to also note that there have been very practical solutions that have been also shared by all the presenters. And it would be wonderful if these could be taken forward, especially by our host, both our hosts, so that at least there is some continuity. Prof. Mayiwa talked about this not just being an academic exercise, but it should be more of a political one. She came with a suggestion around a charter on higher education, gender transformation, and it's something that could be taken up even by the communities of practice through the center, so that at least there is some tangible work outcome actually from this exercise. Other tangible suggestions were around metric passes for women students, learners, and access to higher education, training programs, and on the chat also information, concerns around regional qualifications, recognition, age restrictions. So thank you, Dr. Makukwana. I do see that you say you'll be sending a formalized summary and share early next year, because we really can't, in the pressure of time, end up like really leaving things hanging. But we are here really as interested communities of practice, and we want to see action. We want to make sure something comes out of this engagement today. So we've got basically for Prof. Musuetsa 5 minutes. She needs to be coming in, but there is one comment that was made on the chat addressed to the panelists really about the issue of age restrictions to 35 years for people to be able to apply for scholarship, to participate, that those are also very restrictive, and what the panel's view on that is. While we may not be able to address that fully, but it would be good just to have maybe, okay, so you're saying we can have at least about 10 minutes. Thank you so much. Is it Spogazi? If we can address maybe one or two of the questions. I'm not sure which one, if you've got any others that maybe I couldn't see, but I think most were comments. The two that really needed some response and some thinking from the panel was then about the age restriction and the regional qualifications. But there might be some other burning question. I'm not sure if the participants actually are able to talk at all, or if it's just writing under Q&A. So in the 10 minutes that we're being given, if we could look at a question that could be addressed or a comment from the audience, so that it's not just us talking to the audience only, but if there is something really that you would like to contribute, this is the time. If there is a question or a comment, before we close off with the last comments from the two panelists really that we have. So Sipho, are we able to get the participants to talk, or is it only writing on the Q&A?
So Prof, we could move. What I could do for you, Prof, is that I could read about 3 of the questions if the panelists would like me to do that. I'm not sure if they've had time to go through the chat section as they were presenting. So I could just rope out, I've noted the questions that you are also referencing. So perhaps I could read them if that would work.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, let me just get to it. Here we go. Okay, so the one question from Kwezi Umlwana is on, Kwezi says, it's a common question. Kwezi says, the age restrictions placed on many academic, scholarship, and fellowship opportunities, like 35 years, automatically exclude women. So, and they don't take into account the many factors that delay women's progress in the academy. Such age restrictions should be applied differently to women. What do the panelists think? And then a question from Prof. Nomalanga Mkhize, comment, is what we possibly need is an integrated qualifications authority. And the reason for this is simply that the commercialization of higher education means that there are so many new qualifications all over the place. And in South Africa, particularly, there are so many private education institutions growing. And then I think this is also one that was mentioned by Prof. This is from Duduzile Sokela. Duduzile says, poverty remains a huge barrier for other women. There are many factors preventing them from pursuing education, and this has become a worrying trend. The evidence is found in the SASSA database, where some are child support grant beneficiaries. How many of these young women reach matric? And when we see the school dropout reports compiled, the Department of Education always tells the public about matric pass rate, but is mum about those women who have dropped out? Where do these girls end up? And just as it goes on, let's not forget about the societal pressure the girls are subjected to, being in a state of need and witnessing their peers owning smartphones and devices. This is really sad. Society keeps hearing about generational poverty. We're not hearing society talk about generational worth. The issue of role models is also the biggest problem. And okay, Prof. Dube, are those okay?
Yes, that sounds like enough. Thank you very much. So I think if the panelists could pick any of those questions and address them. Unfortunately, I couldn't see all of them, but I think it's been helpful. But if you can, Dr. Lewin, Prof. Paswana, if you could address any of those questions, we would appreciate that. Also, as part of your closing words, because still we've got now 10 minutes to closing, more or less.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm running on a 5% battery. That's why I'm jumping in. But I realized that some of these questions were comments, especially the SASSA one. It's a comment, and I think Prof. Nomalanga there was also responding to someone who was raising an issue around the removal of around in Sadiq. I think somebody was asking a question around why we can't have a one system as Sadiq countries. But the question that I want to come in, I want to agree with the, what's her name, who's talking around age, the 35 year, is this Kwezi? Kwezi's question around, I think I would want to agree with Kwezi that these limitations are very problematic because majority of our young women below 35 or below 40, let me say. Some, for many reasons, they are chasing the biological clock, you know, of fertility and all of these things, which is a big factor for some of them to even think about pursuing studies or doing these other things. And when you cut off at 35, you are actually indeed excluding a lot of women, a lot of women. I mean, if we have to think about how many women actually have a master's at 35. So it's a big problem because some of these fundings, because of this age, I mean, I remember myself, I've seen a lot of fellowships or this thing, and they cut at 45, and I'm over 45, and I'm asking myself how it means some of these things I won't be able to do them anytime in my life, even if I want them, because I'm past beyond the 45 years. It's still a problem, even for us as academics to attain certain fellowships abroad because of our age. So I think I want to agree with Kwezi that this needs to be looked at in terms of funding, because we cannot apply the same logic to men and women. I think I wanted to come in to say I'm agreeing with Kwezi on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Lewin. Any comments on the submissions? What happened to the Sadiq protocol on higher education and training? Is that still alive?
Still there. It's still there. What it means is that Sadiq students can study in South Africa at the same, tuition rates as our students do here, and it has greatly facilitated access for Sadiq students coming into South Africa. As you know, we have quite large numbers of postgraduate students from Sadiq. I also want to respond on that issue, and I'd much rather hear from Prof. Mkhize about what government can do around the corporatization of universities, bearing in mind that not that I am in any way assuming that there isn't more that can be done. I think there must be. I'm just really interested to know what it is at the level of funding of the system, policy development, as well as the issue of oversight of the system and the monitoring of the system, which is essentially the role that the DHET plays in the system. And not all of that is visible work, but I mean, I certainly think it would be interesting, from a policy perspective, to understand more about how that might shift. I'm not sure. Well, I certainly don't have all the answers to that. I would love to have a discussion with you, Prof. And then on the issue of age, I think it's an important issue. I myself only started my PhD after the age of 40. Finished. Yes, call a workshop. I finished about sort of halfway through my 40s. Took me 6.5 years. But I mean, I'm not in an academic context, but I mean, I'm not that abnormal in terms of the age at which I finished. I think if you look at the statistics, South African academics are finishing PhDs much later. If you look in particular fields of study, academics in a number of areas, particularly in the field of education, often have prior careers in whether it's in schooling or in school governance, often coming into academia as a second career, and that happens for a lot of women, that they tend to come into academia quite late. So I think those are very real issues, and what I would say about it, those are exactly the kind of issues that have to be made visible, because it is precisely the things that institutions that are so normalized in institutions, in practices and traditions of academia that are so so entrenched that unless you make them visible, then institutional practices really don't change. And it relates to all kinds of technologies around how jobs, how jobs are organized and how selection processes, as Amina Mama said way back in 2003, how how hierarchies work, how workloads are set up within academic departments, and there's all kinds of interesting areas where this needs to be illuminated. And so I agree that as an issue to be explored, it's definitely something that needs to be made more visible and explored. And obviously, if this is something that would specifically change, really make a shift for gender equity, then it's something that needs to be thought through quite carefully. And I think those are the things that policy has addressed inadequately, and maybe where institutions, certainly at institutional level, need to think much more deeply about what they're doing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewin. Yes, can you hear me? It says here I'm still muted. Okay, it looks like now I'm fine. Thanks for that input. I see there is continued exchange also on the chat, and I think that's very useful responses around really career for women and having basically those I need to even say this carefully, because it's always seen as if it's an excuse, or that it's something that women choose to do, but it's just in the nature of things that you may wish to be starting a family and all of that. But yet, when it comes to measurements, everybody is sort of measured on an equal basis, as if women have also had opportunities throughout. So please do note the exchange that's happening on the chat box. That's very useful. I think there was also a question, a very important question around mentoring for PhD students. I think it's Marilyn Ramatsui who would like to find out about a structure that mentors new women academics or those who want to enter academia. I think panelists can add, but usually, I'm not sure which institution you are at, Marilyn, but usually at institutional level, there should be mentoring programs. And if not, well, at national level, actually, the NRF used to do some program, and I think that's not quite as active anymore. But really, a lot depends on which institution you are at and what initiatives they have. One thing I know is that all institutions want to grow their PhD and postgraduate numbers, and also all institutions are happy to grow their own timber and recruit from their own students where possible. So it would be best also to find out from within your institution. But you've got good role players here also here on this platform. Dr. Lewin, I'm not sure if there is any other PhD drive for mentoring PhD students, especially who are interested in academia at national level, since the PhD program at NRF kind of died off and was replaced by other initiatives. Dr. Lewin?
Pam, there's quite a lot through the University Capacity Development Program, but it's very much focused on, and rightly so, on academic staff in the system obtaining their PhDs, which is also obviously a significant policy focus at the moment, given the NDP goals and that. So yes, but the NRF, I guess through the Saki Chairs program, and is also addressing these issues partially, but I don't in any way think that what's being done is enough. There's a hell of a lot more that needs to be done. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you very much. Yeah, there's so many issues. You are right, Kwesi. There's so many issues that need to be followed up on that have been flagged in this platform. But thank you, Dr. Makokwana, for saying that how this is going to be structured going forward, and that this is not the end. So participants on the platform and the panelists, I think this is the end of our engagement for today. We've got now really, it's 6, and I believe Professor Mosotsa has been replaced by Aurelia, who is now going to be giving us the closing remarks. But I'll hand over first to Sipogazi. Oh, Prof. Mosotsa is still there. Okay, so I saw another message here. But thank you so much again to the panelists for all your input. There's so much more that we could have discussed and engaged on. As role players in higher education, even myself, I was hoping, we could have more engagement, but of course we do not have the time. But this is just a very important step. And thank you to the organizers for, kickstarting off this conversation and interrogating ways on how we can address these issues. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sipogazi.
Thanks so much, Prof. Dube. And just in the interest of time, I'll just one line, Prof. Sarah's bio. Prof. Sarah, as you come for closing comments, of course, the Chief Executive Officer at the National Institute for Humanities and Social Science. Over to you.
Thank you, Sipo. Professor Dube, thank you so much for leading the discussion today. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll get right to it and maybe take maybe 4 or 5 minutes. So first, coming from our side as NIHSS and me personally, we were challenged many years ago, and every day we are still challenged on what is our role as the NIHSS on transformation, on gender justice in higher education, with particular reference to the humanities and social sciences, but just generally in higher education. I want to just highlight a few things in response to that to that challenge. And we went, just get into our website, you'll get a sense of what the amount of work we've been able to do, and proudly so in conversation with many people who are on this platform. And I'm very happy to see some of the old friends also joining in the conversation. The first one is that we almost took a deliberate approach of partnering, of establishing partnerships with certain institutions, and one of our favorite ones is Nelson Mandela. Of course, this is why we're here. We've partnered with Nelson Mandela to do a number of things, and part of that is why we are here today. And I want to particularly thank the VC, the Dean, Babalwa, and my friend, a fellow academic and doing very well, Pumla, for holding us accountable, but also for making sure that the partnership lives through these conversations, and it's conversations like this that need to continue happening. And ongoing conversations is exactly how we've always thought that transformation should also be top of mind, and we should not let it die. I know that it's dying a silent death, where we are talking meritocracy in other bureaucratic sense, in very managerial sense, especially in higher education, but also in society generally. We are living in a country where we think that transformation, or even talking about gender justice, is a swear word, and that is why these conversations are important for us to have on a day-to-day basis, on a weekly basis. And I want to thank Nelson Mandela University and our friends there, Babalwa and team, for holding that fort with us. I also want to thank the speakers who spoke today, Tandy wearing different hats, and particularly a head at D-Head for supporting the NIHSS and doing the work that we do through our partnerships. I also want to thank Professor Mayua as well for her input. So yes, dialogue is important, conversations are important, but there's one thing else that is very important to us and that we need, and I think it is also something that has come up as a significant pillar for this conversation, is ongoing research. And this is the work that Edith is drawing from, that most people are drawing from. That ongoing research on gender justice, on transformation, is important. We can't be anecdotal as we talk about transformation or gender justice. Otherwise, we're going to be rubbished. Otherwise, we're going to be called names. Otherwise, we're not going to come up with statistics that and also not just quantitative data, qualitative data. These are real lived experiences, and we're happy that some of our the research that we funded has seen the light of day through ongoing research, and the work of Professor Paswan comes to mind, and many others that we've supported. Yes, ongoing research, but let's also continue to write. Let's also continue to publish, and I'm very pleased that at NMU again, our important partner in all of these discussions, Pumla leading the SACHI chair, and her thinking around what to document and how does it take us forward. And I want to encourage that we continue to write, and I want to also make an undertaking that those are the kind of work that NIHSS wants to fund and continue to fund and support. Leveraging on, and these will be my last two comments, leveraging on what Professor Meyiwa was also talking about, transformation gender justice is very political. And that is why we'll be shut down when we talk about that we need a such a change in gender, in the ways that Pumla has thought through that and many others. And I note the work that is also ongoing at UNISA through the new chair led by Puleng, that side. For me, what came out very strongly was that it is urgent. Let's practice not only our own agency, personal and collective agency, but also that it is urgent that we address these matters. Finally, I want also, in the interest of time, also make mention of what Tandy was talking about earlier on, or quoting earlier on. The ministerial task team has about 20 recommendations being part of that ministerial task team that I want to implore all of you to at least engage with those recommendations as they apply to your own institutions. I think sometimes when such work is done, we don't fully engage with it and change our institutions accordingly from within. Finally, I also want to agree that we need to build alliances beyond the ivory towers of our universities. Sometimes as academics, we talk about transformation and gender justice in higher education, even ourselves, in very elitist terms. I think that we can do more if we forge alliances with the very communities that sometimes we think we are speaking for. Or against or towards. For me, I think we can go much quicker. The project can go much quicker. The political and personal project can go much quicker if we forge these alliances. We also already forge these alliances when we do our research and when we publish. But when it comes to the political agenda, we shy away from those. I know I said finally, but Sipo, finally, I want again to thank the organizers for partnering with us on this important conversation. There's more to come. I know that Babalwa has plans of publications and more conversations. I want to also say on behalf of NIHSS, we want to support all of these initiatives. If anything, please drop us an email, drop me an email, muswets@nihss.ac.za. I'll be happy to engage on how we can move together very quickly and using the Institute as our leverage for that. With that, I want to thank you so much for your patience and for listening to me. Good to see old friends as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Prof. Saran, for staying, for managing to stay until the end. Colleagues, thank you for being part of this discussion. I'd like to wish you all a happy day or afternoon or evening further. Thank you so much.